One of those days, Jesus went out to a mountainside to pray and spent the night praying to God. When morning came, he called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them, whom he also designated apostles. Simon, whom he named Peter, his brother Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, son of Alphaeus, Simon, who was called the Zealot, Judas, son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor.
We're a week and a half into the Lenten season, and I hope each of you is doing something special for Lent. Maybe it's just that you're reading the Bible a little bit more, or reading the Bible period, or giving up something for God, making a deliberate effort to know more about God and to move closer to Him, even if it's nothing more than just noticing the beauty of nature all around you and feeling closer to God because of it. So if you haven't started Lent yet, the celebration of it and doing something for it, and it's a week and a half into it, I'm going to give you a special dispensation to go ahead and start now, okay? I thought Lent would be a good time to talk about the apostles, those folks Jesus chose out of all the people in Israel to be His students and later teachers and evangelists. The 12 people He had picked to spread His gospel until it would one day cover the world and change it forever. To help me in my, let's see, can you cut this? Is this on? We're getting feedback. To help me in my talk about the apostles, I want you to remember back to your junior high school days. For you younger folks, that's middle school now. The days in junior high when we knew everything and felt sorry for our teachers that were so ignorant. Mark Twain said it best about those years when he wrote, "When I was a boy of 14, my father was so ignorant I could hardly stand to have the old man around. But when I got to be 21, I was astonished at how much he had learned in 7 years." This morning I'm going to refer back to the sometimes humiliating experience in junior high of how teams were picked for baseball or basketball or Red Rover or whatever. Two of your classmates would be the captains, and they would pick from the group for their teams. I would stand there, and I was sure that I'd be the first one picked, or at worst, the second one picked. And the only thing I was concerned about was that I wouldn't get to be on the team with a good captain. Well, unfazed that I was not the first choice of either captain, I figured they'd made a mistake and would surely pick me the next round. After the second round went by and I still wasn't picked, I was now sure that they probably hadn't seen me, so worked my way to the front of the group and stand there. But I did notice that when they scanned the group, they zipped right over me with their eyes as they scanned the next round of draft picks. The next person picked was Mary Lou Middlebrook, the girl who could out-jump, out-run, out-shot put, out-spit any boy in junior high. I thought, sure, that was a good choice. I would have done that. When they picked the bookworms ahead of me, the ones who thought that baseball was a low-class fancy dance party, I began to really feel humiliated. Finally, one of them would say, "You can have Seekamp," when I was the last one left. The other captain would roll his eyes knowing that he should have said that first. The point is, you don't have to don't encourage him. The point is that all the athletic studs and studettes were picked first. They were the obvious choices. They had the sporting skills, the experience, the strength. They were the ones that any reasonable, logical person would have chosen. You would have think that Jesus would also have made reasonable, logical choices when He chose the 12 apostles. After all, they were priests to choose from, scribes, elders, learned teachers of the law who knew the Scripture inside out and could quote from memory most of the Torah, which was the Jewish Bible. But their minds were closed to any new teachings about their religion or about God. They would have done the equivalent of covering their ears and singing the national anthem like we used to do as kids to keep from hearing Jesus' ideas. Oh, say, can you see? To them, his teachers were blasphemy. They didn't want to hear it. There were high officials in the temple. Indeed, there were emperors and kings and princes they could have chosen from. There were wealthy folks or intellectually elite folks he could have opted for. Instead, Jesus chose ordinary, nondescript, working people to be his apostles. People like we run into every day. People who would laugh at the very idea that God would use them to change the world. In fact, they were people who laughed and cried and celebrated. They were people who loved life and lived it to the fullest every day. They were the kind of folks that you and I like to be with. Sincere and honest and warm. Trustworthy people who could tell interesting stories, who would share what they had with you, and perhaps more importantly, who would listen to you and be receptive to what you had to say. The term disciple means a learner or follower, and initially the crowds that followed Jesus were just that. They were followers and learners. The term apostle, however, means a messenger who is sent out under the authority of someone and who has the same authority as the person who sent them. The 12 Jesus chose from all his disciples would go out with his full authority. Jesus came to change the world, not in one fell swoop. His message had to be absorbed, accepted into the heart and mind, and revealed through actions of love. The reading from Luke that John just read told us that once again Jesus withdrew from the others and went alone to a place high in the mountains, high up where the air was clean, where the far vistas of the land were clearly visible, and where he could feel a part of the beauty of the sky. There, he could be far away from human companionship with all his distractions, and there he could be alone with God. Sort of reminds you of his stay in the wilderness, doesn't it? There, alone and apart from all the distractions of the world below, Jesus let his mind and his soul commune with God as the shadows lengthened and as the sun set. He watched as the stars appeared and overhead one by one, and the great constellations made their great arc across the sky hour after hour, until the blush of dawn slowly extinguished each star and the sun rose over the beautiful Transjordan mountains. During those hours alone on the mountain, Jesus was asking God to help him in choosing the 12 he would call his apostles. More importantly, he was intently listening for God's answer. If a leader is going to embark on any great undertaking, the first thing he must do is choose a staff. They will determine the success or failure of any undertaking. Jesus carefully chose the 12 to be his apostles. Why 12? There were originally 12 tribes of Israel, each representing one of the sons of Jacob. And after Israel went to the promised land, the land was divided up among those 12 tribes, all their descendants. Now that Jesus was bringing a new covenant to Israel and to mankind, those 12 apostles represented the new Israel. The lives of the 12 apostles are largely unknown. There is even some uncertainty about the names of some of them. Indeed, some are hardly more than names, and the stories told of them are tradition and legend rather than recorded history. But the fact that their records were blank may be further evidence that they were ordinary men when judged by our human standards. They found their greatness through Jesus. We do know that they were diverse in their temperament and their gifts. Some led, some followed, but all needed encouragement and all needed to have their way of thinking about things changed. By all outward appearances, they seemed very ordinary. They had no wealth, maybe except for Matthew, no academic background and no social position. They were fishermen and tax collectors and others from backgrounds that were too undistinguished to have been recorded. Jesus sees in every person not only what the person is, but also what he can make that person into, just as it is with you and I. Jesus transformed them into men who turned the world upside down. Nothing that was in those men could have accomplished that themselves. The power that came to them was from Jesus. Now you might be thinking, why in the world was Judas chosen to be one of the 12? The answer is that though God's grace is fully given, there is within every person the awful choice and the freedom to refuse it. There was available to Judas the same inspirations that made the other disciples great, but the inspiration which God offers is never compulsory to take. So let's take a look at each of the 12 that Jesus chose. I call them the Deity dozen, with apologies to the movie The Dirty Dozen. As I mentioned with the lesser-known apostles, a lot of their stories are based on tradition rather than recorded history. Now, the portraits of the apostles you're going to see were all painted by a Texas artist named Kenneth Wyatt. I believe he lives in Rawls, Texas. He used people from everyday walks of life, people in Oklahoma and Texas. He used them as his models. And these portraits are his interpretation from his reading of the scripture of what he thinks the apostles might have looked like. First on our list is Simon, called Peter. He is always first on all the lists of the apostles found in the Bible and is regarded as the most prominent. Is that John or is that Peter? Diana? That's Peter. Okay. I didn't recognize him. Bad light. Anyway, he's probably the most famous of the apostles. He was a fisherman by trade, and we all know how salty professional fishermen can be. He left his nets readily and followed Jesus. He was quick to tell Jesus what was on his mind and in no uncertain terms. Peter was passionate and impulsive. He often let his weaknesses show. He argued, he let his temper rage, he bragged, he cursed, slashed out with his sword, and finally, he denied Christ himself. Imperfect? Yes. But this imperfect Simon, by the power of God, became Peter, the rock on which Christ built his church here on earth. The big fisherman truly became a fisher of men and fervently evangelized the rest of his life, this new faith. Persia, Britain, Gaul, Babylon, and Rome were places in which Peter probably traveled and preached, ministered, and organized churches. Twice he was imprisoned in Rome. After 9 months of cruel torture, he was crucified. But he was crucified upside down because he felt he was not worthy to be crucified in the same way that Jesus was. And while he was in prison, he converted his 2 jailers and 47 inmates to Christ. The next most well-known of the apostles is John, known as the disciple whom Jesus loved. He was also a professional fisherman who put down his nets to follow Christ. Now, he was probably a partner in the fishing business with the 4 other men who became apostles, Peter, Andrew, James, and Jude, and with Zebedee, his father. John's intent and forthright nature, as well as that of his brother James, is reflected in their nickname, the Sons of Thunder. He had been a disciple of John the Baptist. His zeal for Christ and the spreading of the gospel earned him the label John the Evangelist. Of all the apostles, John was the only one that was not martyred. Jesus foretold this very fact. John probably lived well into his 90s and died peacefully in the city of Ephesus in about the year 101 AD, the last apostle to die. And while John was the last apostle to die, his brother James was the first to be martyred for Christ. James, the other son of thunder, was the older brother of John. Peter, James, and John were the first to be called by Jesus. These three formed the innermost circle of Christ's disciples. They were the ones that Jesus would draw out from the 12 to share certain significant events, such as his transformation on the mountain. Tradition places James in missionary work in India and Spain. King Herod Agrippa I ordered James to be put to death by beheading in 44 AD, 11 years after Jesus was crucified. Andrew was the first to proclaim, "We have found the Messiah." He was the first to say, "Come and see." Andrew is sometimes known as the usher, for he was continually bringing people or ushering people in to Jesus. In fact, he was the one that brought his brother Peter to Jesus. He even found a way for a small boy with loaves and fishes to stand next to Jesus. Andrew was a fisherman by trade also. Like John, he had been a disciple of John the Baptist. After the death and resurrection of Jesus, Andrew stayed in Jerusalem and ministered there for several years, becoming a prominent leader in the early church. Tradition records that Andrew probably went to southern Russia, Greece, Ephesus, maybe even Scotland. Andrew was martyred on an X-shaped cross, and that very cross is a symbol of our denomination, and it's on the chalice of the Disciples of Christ logo. You can see it on that far banner, the cross on the goblet. It's known as the St. Andrew's cross. Philip was an Israelite, but his name was Greek and means lover of horses. When Philip was asked by Jesus to go with him to Galilee, he was so excited that he ran and got his friend Nathanael to come and meet this Jesus, the Messiah. There are few references to him. We do know that he preached in southern Russia and probably in France. Bartholomew was also referred to as Nathanael, and in fact, Nathanael was probably his first name. Some consider him a skeptic because of his question, "Can anything good come from Nazareth?" Jesus saw through this skepticism and said that there was no deceit in Nathanael. Innocent, pure, a case of what you see is what you get. He presumably traveled to Ethiopia and Egypt, India, and Greater Armenia, preaching the gospel. Tradition tells us that Matthew, sometimes known as Levi the tax collector, spent most of his ministry in and around Judea and then in Ethiopia. He was well educated and somewhat wealthy, though hated by the Jews because he was a tax collector for the Romans. Again, Jesus saw beneath the surface to the real man inside. Matthew went on to write one of the Gospels. Now, everyone knows doubting Thomas. Yet Thomas was a believer. There is no doubt about that. After seeing the risen Christ and placing his hand in the wounds of Jesus, Thomas was a changed man, a man of flaming courage, a preacher with a spirit of missionary zeal that would carry him to the far reaches of the known and the unknown world, Babylon, Persia, and India, perhaps also Ceylon and China. Very little is known about James the Younger or James the Lesser, except that he was a brother to Matthew and probably the Matthew of the Gospels. One story about James the Younger was that he prayed so much on his knees that his knees became as hard as camel's hooves, and it earned him the title of Old Camel Knees. Another tradition says that he bore a striking resemblance to Jesus himself, and that is why Judas came up and kissed Jesus, so that the elders and the soldiers would know which man was really Jesus. Now, if Simon, known as the Zealot, had not been in the company of Jesus, he probably would have plunged a dagger into Matthew the first time that he met him. You see, Simon was fiercely loyal to Israel and hated the Roman rule that it was under. He was an open fighter and more than willing to shed blood to place an Israelite on the throne of Israel once again. Tradition says that he evangelized in Egypt, North Africa, Carthage, Spain, Britain, Syria, Mesopotamia, and finally Persia. You can tell he was zealous. His missionary travels may have exceeded those of Paul. The apostle with 3 names is Jude, also known as Thaddeus or Judas. He was the youngest of the apostles, probably about 20 years of age, and more than likely he was the son of James the apostle and grandson of Zebedee. Finally, there is Judas Iscariot, the treasurer of the apostles and a thief, and a man who betrayed Jesus. He always appears last whenever the apostles are listed in the Bible. Some say his dark actions were done to force Jesus to proclaim his messiahship. I don't believe that. But whatever his motives, his choices were wrong and led to his destruction. And his name will forever be associated with dark betrayal. An unlikely bunch, those 12. Hardly the ones that you or I would pick for our companions and staff if we were going to try and change the world. Yet where we often only see what's on the outside, Jesus always sees within us. This ragtag bunch that Jesus selected, this Deity dozen, would succeed beyond anyone's wildest imagination. The earth was forever changed by their spreading of Christ's message. The price they paid to do it was high. All but John suffered agonizing and violent death, and even John suffered greatly. But they never flinched or backed down from proclaiming God's word. Can we do less? You and I are no greater or no lesser than those 12 apostles that Jesus chose. And even though Jesus does not appear to us in person and ask us to be his disciples, he does ask us through the scriptures nonetheless. After the apostles, it was all the countless, nameless, everyday people whose lives and acts were never recorded that spread the gospel to the ends of the earth. Jesus is asking each of us, no, he's commanding each of us every day to continue their work and to help him finish what his Deity dozen had begun. It would please Jesus greatly if you would make a choice to follow in their footsteps and to help spread his word to those who haven't heard it. You could make it a baker's dozen. May God bless this message to each of you.